Morning. So with that said, I'm really happy to introduce Adjunct Professor Patrick Sharry. Patrick works for AGSM, or is an adjunct professor at AGSM, which is Australian Graduate School of Management, which is part of the business school at the University of New South Wales, way over there in Sydney, Australia. So welcome, Patrick. Patrick's got really broad experience as a consultant in both the public and private sector. He works, or used to work, across the world, across the globe, Asia, UK, Europe. But like everyone else, he's probably been spending most of his time in front of his computer and on Zoom calls to other and sort of leadership programs and what have you. But his sweet spot is strategy and decision making at an executive level, and he's done a lot of work here with us in executive education and part of the business school as well. So really happy to hand this afternoon over to you, Patrick, and I'm looking forward to a great afternoon.
Terrific. Thanks, Steph, and nice to meet everybody. I'll learn a little bit about you as we talk about various things over the couple of hours that we've got together.
Sorry, Patrick, sorry to interrupt. I have been given some strict instructions prior to this and I'd forgotten, so my apologies. For everyone who's online, if you are on gallery view, so just up the top right, just to put yourself onto speaker view, and that will be useful for this afternoon's session for what Patrick's doing. Sorry, Patrick, over to you.
And that's what I was about to say, Steph, so well done. So I'm going to work mostly off my improvised flip chart there. It's the closest thing I can get to a room full of whiteboards, and that will be enough for us to work together. The session is intended to be very interactive. Some of that will be, I'll send you into breakout rooms to talk about various things, as Felicity said before. But the other part of that is that you should feel free to ask questions on the way through. And I really like that. So, you know, by all means, either electronically or physically or whatever, put your hand up, and then we can run with questions as we've got them. I'm really, really pleased to see so many people with their videos on. I had a session this morning also in New Zealand where almost no one had a video on, and it's really demoralizing to talk to a series of little black boxes on a screen. So having some faces out there is really good. So thank you very much. We're going to start our conversation thinking about complexity. And I think in the pre-work, you had that great video of George Clooney explaining the Cynefin framework. I think it was George Clooney, was it? And so it was good. I'm going just to really quickly recreate that on the flip chart there, and then take it into the next levels of how we might use this sort of thinking. Over the course of the afternoon, we're going to focus on two main threads. One is, what does this mean for your organisation? And related to that, but different, what does this mean for the strategic project that you're going to be working on? And we'll give you a bit of time to deal with each of those over the course of the afternoon. All good, ready to go? Yep, excellent. So, as you recall, this is the Cynefin framework, the work of Dave Snowden. Cynefin is that Welsh word, the place where your habitat, the place where you belong, the place that gives you meaning. This is a meaning-making framework. So we draw it like that, not like a 2x2 matrix. As you'll recall, some things in life are simple, changing a bicycle tire. Some things in life are complicated, servicing an A380 aircraft. On this side, the link between cause and effect we can see prospectively. Either it's obvious or we can figure that out through analysis. Some things in life are complex, and in that space are most of our long-standing business and social challenges. And some things in life are chaotic, and chaotic, I think, is the old Welsh word for coronavirus. So we have experienced a lot of that in the last couple of months. And so I used to have to explain chaos, but I don't anymore. So you'll also recall from that video that Down here in the simple space, we can have that much overused term, best practice, where we've got one well-established, solid, well-tested way of doing things. Up here, we can't have best practice, but we can have good practice. And so this space is the domain of experts and principles rather than a single best way of doing things. All we can have up here is emergent practice. Because on this side of the chart, the link between cause and effect, if we ever understand it, we can only understand in hindsight. And therefore, the only way we can work on problems like that is actually to get into the problem, go hands dirty, and that way understand how the system might work. And down here, again, as we've all learned in one way or another, can be the domain of novel practice, because it's often only when we're put under some sort of pressure that we find new and interesting ways of doing things. So if you'd asked me certainly 12 months ago whether I could run this sort of session over Zoom in this sort of way, I would have gone, nah, it's never going to work. But I've been forced to experiment and find new ways of working to deal with that sort of chaotic situation. So that's what you saw on the video. So I'm going to take that sort of as read, unless there's any specific questions before we get into it. Okay, one of the ways that I would explain complicated is that about a decade ago now, I completely wrecked that knee. I did it skiing, I deserve minimal sympathy. And I went to see a couple of different surgeons. Of course, there's a few different ways of making sense of the mess I made of that knee. And the knee now works fine, and I appreciate your concern. However, if we think about that in a number of other ways, so if I had done that to my knee 200 years ago, and despite the grey hair, I'm not quite that old, it would have been one of these. It would have been complex because we had no surgery, we didn't know how knees worked, and at best, I would have hobbled for the rest of my life. That's what happened there. And down here, I reckon if I do that to my knee again in 50 years' time, first of all, I will be delighted if I'm still skiing in 50 years' time. But I reckon what they'll do is they'd pop me on the trolley, push me into the room, they'll put the MRI on my leg, and the MRI will be this big and not that big. And that data will go to the cloud, or whatever we're calling it at that stage, into the algorithm, which will instruct the robotic surgeon. And 2 hours later, I'll be out good as gold. Because what good medicine does is it moves things through here to find repeatable, reputable ways of doing things. There's a little catch to that we'll come back to in a little while. But that's what good science, what good medicine does. I'd like to suggest that it's not just good medicine or science that does that, but that's actually what good businesses do too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about McDonald's. Not because I like McDonald's food. I hate McDonald's food. My kids hate McDonald's food. I'm really happy about that. But I do love McDonald's business model. I'm lucky enough to have done a bit of work for them over the last 10 going on for 15 years. And they are a fantastic business. And they don't care that I'm not their customer. They know who their customers are and who they aren't. And strategically, that's important. We'll come back to that bit in a minute. But this is really a conversation about McDonald's business model and shouldn't be misunderstood as an encouragement to go out and get a Big Mac and fries at afternoon tea time. This is just about the business model. So if you think about the beginnings of McDonald's, so it's the 1950s in America. It's absolutely a complex space. There's been a post-war baby boom, and that has brought about the arrival of the first ever generation of teenagers, as we would think of them today, because the sort of sociological construct of a teenager is actually fairly recent. If you go back certainly around the First World War, you went to school until your family made you go and get a job, and then you just worked, and the whole teenage thing, as we think of it, didn't exist at all. And it's in the 1950s in America where that starts to bubble through. And you might remember from a long time ago things like Happy Days, which were all about the arrival of that sort of segment into society. In addition to that, all of the production capacity that had been built up over the Second World War had to go somewhere. And it went into things like white goods, fridges, freezers, that kind of thing. And it also went into cars. And so in the 1950s in America, we see for the first time the impact of the car on society. Cars had been there for a lot longer, of course, but they were now mass produced, more people could afford them, and town planners started to design cities and towns around the car. And in that sort of environment, the Koch brothers and McDonald decide that they can make money running restaurants. So what do? If you've seen the movie, some of these are quite funny. They run a whole series of experiments to figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. And out of those experiments in that complex space, what they do is they generate some principles, because this complicated space is a space of principles. So we've got to have a standardized menu or we won't make any money. People are driving to our restaurant, we need a big car park. Some people are driving, but they don't want to stop and eat. They just want to pick up the food and go. We better have a drive-through. Then they figure out that if you can see more than 2 cars in the queue in the drive-through, you're much less likely to stop. And that's why more or less every McDonald's drive-through on the planet has a corner in it, so you can't see how many cars are in the queue. It's true. People are bringing their families, we need some entertainment, let's have a clown, let's call him Ronald, and the rest is history. And they develop those sorts of principles up here, which allowed them to make progress. And then in what I think is one of the marvels of the modern business world, McDonald's can now take any semi-sensible 15-year-old and turn them into a competent kitchen hand or customer service representative, which is a feat that almost no parents manage in the home. And McDonald's can do that time and time and time again. It's become a standard best practice way of operating for them. And one of the things I love about going out to the McDonald's head office in the north of Sydney, it's one of their global thought leadership centres, and it's also where they do most of their corporate training. To go out there and look at their training materials, which are absolutely top rate, their ability to take that 15-year-old and teach them to flip a burger, and then to run a crew, and then to run a shift, and then to run a restaurant, and everything in between is just fantastic, exemplary. And so McDonald's have actually, as a core capability, this notion that they can experiment with challenges and develop principles and then turn that into best practice ways of operating. So I'm just going to pause there and see if there are any questions or observations, or anyone wants to duck out and order that Big Mac that I told you not to order. And before we go to the next little bit of it. So questions, thoughts, observations? Okay, that looks like we're good, but I'm really happy to take comments. It will make the session a whole lot more enjoyable if we can sort of get into it. So let me tell you the next bit and then we'll see where that takes us. So one of the challenges with this is that as McDonald's is teaching today's batch of 15-year-olds to flip burgers, they're dealing with a global obesity epidemic, a worldwide backlash against their product. And they're dealing with the arrival of Uber Eats and similar sorts of entities into their food ecosystem. And they're really complex challenges. So if we take the Uber Eats one, the food ecosystem one, so it is changing literally as we speak. But if you go back 12 and certainly 24 months, every time McDonald's sent out a Big Mac and fries with Uber Eats, they lost money. Because the margins in the fast food game are pretty thin, even if the product isn't. And the commission that Uber Eats takes is about 30%. And so McDonald's lost money on every Big Mac and fries. Now, they knew at the same time that they couldn't afford not to be part of that system. They had to be in there in some way. Because if they didn't take the burger and fries space, someone else would. And it'd be really hard to come back and try and get in later. And so what did McDonald's do? Well, McDonald's did what McDonald's is so good at. They ran a whole series of experiments to try and figure out what might work. In some places, they started their own home delivery system that worked for them in places like India, but really nowhere else because of the costs associated with it. And another thing that they experimented with was a thing that's called dark kitchens. So, and that's where they've sort of arrived at now. A dark kitchen is a McDonald's kitchen, McDonald's facility, but without any of the customer facing bits. And that means that you don't have to put it on prime real estate on the main road and all that kind of thing. You can put it in a little back block somewhere. It's much lower cost to build because you just need the kitchen bit. They've even experimented with outsourcing some of that. That's a more detailed story. And where they've got to now is that they can produce a burger and fries in one of those dark kitchens, and the only people who come there are the Uber Eats or other riders or drivers, and they can still make money because the unit cost of producing a burger in that setting is lower than it is in a standard McDonald's. And so they've got to the point now where that's at the principal stage, and they're doing, again, what McDonald's do so well. They're in the process of rolling that out and scaling it in a way that will make it best practice. And they learn a lot by doing that as they go. And that ability to experiment with stuff, to develop principles that can then be scaled is one of McDonald's key attributes. If we think about the global obesity epidemic, the same logic applies. So about 5 kilometres from where I live, there's a non-McDonald's McDonald's. Somewhat paradoxically, it's in the grounds of a hospital. And you could go in there and you wouldn't even know it was a McDonald's. There's a little compliance plaque down the bottom, next to the door that says part of the McDonald's group. But otherwise, there are no golden arches. Ronald does not make an appearance, and there's no Big Mac and fries. Because what McDonald's is doing in that space is experimenting with healthy menu choices. So there's lots of salads and wraps and that kind of thing that they will then turn into the principles of a standardized healthy menu that once they've got it right, they'll then scale and roll out. I could tell you the same story about McCafe. That was an observation that they had assets that were underutilized in the morning relative to the rest of the day. How could they take advantage of that? They ran a whole lot of experiments that turned into the principles of McCafe that's now standardized and rolled out around the world. So again, I'm just going to pause and see if there's any thoughts or observations about that, because this is one of the big ideas about dealing with complexity, that we need the ability to experiment, to create principles that turn into standard best practice ways of operating.
Taken from like the Toyota way, where the Japanese, I guess, take little experiments all the time to develop good practice, and as you say, then to scale it. Is that sort of where it originated, or has it got earlier roots?
Yeah, it's got much earlier roots than that. But let me just locate that Toyota production methodology in this chart, and I'll just spin it a little bit, Richard, and talk about it as a Lean Six Sigma approach, which is not exactly Toyota, but pretty close. A lot of those sorts of approaches. So, if you think about the Lean Six Sigma stuff, is about once we've got these principles, how do we experiment to find a best practice way of operating? McDonald's are doing a little bit more than that. And I'm not saying Toyota don't, but McDonald's are doing a little bit more than that, in that they're actively engaging with what for them is a rapidly changing ecosystem. And then when they get that, they've got their own version of this. They don't use a Lean Six Sigma, but they've got their own version of how do we take a principle and make it scalable in a best practice way. Good. Other stuff?
Patrick, how long does McDonald's spend in each of these stages for an idea? How long does it take them to get from the complex around the chart sort of thing?
Yep. So let me answer another question and then come back to yours, Alex, if that's okay. So one is to make obvious that McDonald's, any organisation, has got some of this and some of this and some of that and even a little bit of that all the time. So it's not that you have one thing and you take it through, you've got lots of this stuff going on all the time. So how long does it take to work your way through there? If we think about the Uber Eats thing, as far as I know, McDonald's has been working on that in some way for about 5 years. If we take the global obesity epidemic, when I first started working with McDonald's a bit over a decade ago, they were grappling with some of that stuff at that stage. And so they're always sort of looping through on this. So another of the things that McDonald's is really good at is they're really clear about what it is that they sell. And they know that what they sell for many people is not the Big Mac and fries or the whatever, it's actually time. The fact that you can be driving from violin practice to soccer training with a couple of screaming kids in the back, and you know that you can pull into the McDonald's drive-through, pick up whatever it is that the kids will eat, and food will keep children quiet. It's one of the principles of the universe. And then you can drive to wherever it is you have to go next, and that won't take much time. So McDonald's know they sell time. They also know that in that sort of setting, often the kids would be fed, but the parent wouldn't buy anything for themselves. And so that was the launch a bit over a decade ago of McDonald's experimenting with salads and things like that, so that you could get the Big Mac and fries for the kids, and the parent in the front of the car, if they wanted a healthier choice, would have something that they could buy. And so McDonald's always iterates on that stuff. So they started back then, but they're always looking to improve it. And, if I go back to Richard's observation about Toyota a moment ago, one of the great things about Toyota is they never, ever, ever rest on their laurels. They're always looking to make things better. And McDonald's is the same. It's kind of nice and kind of cute. If you go out to that facility that I was talking about where they do their training, when you walk through the foyer, what you see is a whole lot of display cases of earth-shattering innovations, like their first double wand thick shake blender that then became the 5-wand thick shake blender. So the one person on the station could mix 5 thick shakes at a time and not just 2. And they're always looking for those little improvements. And that's one of the things that makes them such a great business. Rish, you've got a hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, and I'm sure it'll come back to me in a moment here. It's always the way. As soon as you get called on, oh no. So culturally, when you talk about having this sort of process of being able to, I guess, devote time into things like experimentation, which means obviously resources and time going into potentially failed experiments as well. How do you sort of influence, or how important is this to be led by the executive team down versus is there room to do this kind of experimentation? I guess and one of the things I'm always trying to figure out is it easier to prove out a concept or prove out an approach and then sell it to the exec, or is it something that you need to be executive led in order to really commit to doing something like this, taking an approach?
So one of the answers that I think Felicity and Stephanie are looking for at this point is, as a C-suite program, we're telling you this stuff so that when you're an executive yourself, you've got a bit of a handle on it. Another answer would be some organizations manage this through what are called skunk works. So someone sort of puts aside a little bit of budget and they run a little thing on the side, and when they've got it proved up, then they take it to the boss and say, oh, look, we made one of these. What do you reckon? And that can be really successful. So if you look at companies like Lockheed Martin, they have institutionalized the notion of skunk works. Or if you look at organizations like 3M, 3M has a rule that all of its engineering and research people need to spend, I think it's 20% of their time on a project that interests them, that's not part of their main work. And the only condition is that you've got to do it and you've got to tell people about it. Because, you know, why do we have things like Post-it notes? Because two people working independently on stuff in IBM, in 3M, sorry, working on stuff in 3M, happened to present at the same workshop. And one of them was looking for something to hold places in books. He actually was a member of a choir and wanted to mark his pages. And the other one had invented this glue that didn't seem to work so well because it sort of stuck for a little while, but it didn't stick things forever. And they looked at each other and went, this is what we need. So there are ways of institutionalizing, and I mean that in a really positive sense, institutionalizing this innovation. But that needs to be ideally sponsored from senior execs because it is, as you, I think, opened up there, it's a really cultural thing. What are our expectations of working together?
Excellent.
Good. There was a little, I'm just going to go to the chat there. I noticed there was a, are there good ways of running experiments from Jean? Yes, there are. And I might come back and talk a little bit about some of those and link them into the cultural pieces that Rish just led us into in a little while. So just hold that thought and we'll come back to it. So let me just close that so I can see more of you. That's good. So what we're going to do now is just send you into some breakout rooms. And
just a question for me while you're waiting. How many businesses do you think typically operate with this, I guess 2 by 2 in mind, and, you know, actively and consciously have this in their thinking from what you've seen over the years?
Not nearly as many as I would like, Warwick, would be the short answer. We'll talk about this in a little while, but most people actually just want the world to be simple because that's convenient. It's not right, but it's convenient. And that means that they don't do the sort of thing that's required in particularly this space up here in the complex space.
Yeah.
If you sort of follow through on some of this stuff, and if you like, I can post a recommendation in the chat in a little while. Hang on, I'll just make this little bit here go away. Dave Snowden has actually done a lot of work with the military, and perhaps surprisingly, they use this sort of thinking a lot in what they do, particularly in the special forces area, and we might talk a little bit about that over the course of this afternoon. So it does, there are places where it's really well established in the organisational psyche, but not nearly as many as I think would be useful. And one of the implications of that is that it creates the sort of short-termism that's led to so many of our ecological disasters and so on, because we just keep wanting a simple answer to problems that actually live up there. But we might come to that in a bit. Good, so have we got everyone back now? Em, it looks like we do.
Yep, they're all back.
That's great, thank you. So Warwick and I started a bit of a conversation there about how well established is this in organisations, and you probably tuned into the end of that. I'm interested in other things that came up in the conversations you had in your breakout rooms.
We go in reverse. Simple to complicated to complex.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute, Daryl. So just tell us what your perspective is on that.
Sometimes the answer's so obvious it's sitting in front of you and you just ruminate on it. You get 20 people in a room, can't make a decision because the committee don't agree, you know, simple shit like a naming standard or, you know, it's just, and it becomes less about fact, but opinion or the desire to be right versus a proper outcome. And basically it's just humans getting in a room and being silly, you know, that kind of thing.
Yep. A little bit later this afternoon, we want to talk about the decision-making side of this. And the little immediate link here is that, you know, we want there to be, you know, a single best way to do this. And we want to be able to put 20 people in a room and figure it out. But the reality is, and this is what McDonald's is, one of the things McDonald's is so good at, sometimes you've just got to run the experiments because you can't actually know how this will play out. You've got to get your hands dirty, and it's only by experimenting with that stuff that you'll actually make some progress. 20 people sitting in a room is never going to do it. So from a decision-making perspective, that's a really important insight. That's good. What else did you talk about?
Sorry, Jackie here. So in our breakout room, the topic we talk about is about how innovative can you be or any new changes that you can do. So I shared about working for Fisher & Paykel Healthcare and medical equipment. We are highly regulated. So, but we do have an R&D focus, so research and development focus, where we try to be ahead of the therapy that we are providing. So we're not really competing, but making sure that we're ahead. So the changes that we do and the decision making that we do as an organization will be based on standards. We have that basis that we need to meet those standards. We need to comply with those standards. And that's our basis of decision. There are obviously leeway on how we can go about change, but within those parameters.
That's great, Jacqueline. So one of the things that Dave Snowden would say about experiments in that space is that you should never run an experiment unless you're clear about how you can shut it down or how you can scale it up. So if it doesn't work, you want to be able to shut it down quickly. And if it's working, you want to be able to scale it up. And so particularly in a highly regulated environment, healthcare would be a standout for that, that's extra important. The other thing, which we'll touch on in a little while, is how important establishing the boundaries of what you can do in this complex space are. So, you know, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare would never allow anyone to trial a device on a patient if there was a good chance it was going to kill them. Right? There's boundaries, there's rules about what you do and what you don't do. And making those boundaries clear is really important. And that's true even if you're not in a highly regulated space like healthcare. That's valuable, important in any sort of space. So that's great. Thank you, Jacqueline. One more?
One of the conversations we had, and I was just curious about, is structurally, when you're trying to move things through that sort of cycle, do you often find that there are people sort of specialized in the complex space, the complicated space, and the simple, or is it the same people that can help move something through that, you know, end to end, I guess, take something that's complex, look at emerging practices, and then sort of standardize it down to a best practice at some point?
Yeah, so Rish, I think that people definitely have preferences. That is, we can grow and change within that, but people have preferences. The other thing, I'm going to do the next bit that I was going to do, and then I want to come back, Rish, to exactly that comment. So let me do a little bit more, come back to Rish's comment, And then we'll take that on and we'll link it back into what Jacqueline was saying before, and Daryl's stuff as well. So one of the other little features of this is that this boundary here between simple and chaotic is different from the others, because when things go wrong here, they tend not to tootle back up into complicated. They tend to go off the cliff and into chaos. So if you think about running a call center, for example, best practice for running a call center is to have a good, robust phone system and a completely separate standalone backup system, which is all well and good until that one falls over and that one won't boot. And then you've got complete chaos because you've got hundreds or thousands of people trying to dial in or transact or whatever it might be. And so when things go wrong here, they tend to go off the cliff and into chaos. Now, there's a number of implications of that. The first is that, and you've got to listen to this carefully because it's a little bit nuanced. It is absolutely in a business's best interest to try to put things down here. You know, if you can imagine if McDonald's had to rethink every time it wanted to train a kid to flip hamburgers, it'd just be a disaster. And so they've got a standard operating procedure for doing that, right? So it's definitely in business's best interest to do that. The problem is we can put things down here and we can become complacent about them. And if we become complacent about them, we take our eye off the ball, what easily happens is that we end up in here. Because one of the things that I can't recreate on Zoom is a 4-dimensional whiteboard. Because the reality is that this thing is moving through time, and things that were best practice today will be irrelevant and will end up in here. And so that's true of business models, it's true of products, services, internal processes within an organization. If we sort of think, oh, I've got that now, we never had to think about it again, then we risk moving over here. And again, in the McDonald's context, McDonald's has changed the way that it trains its young staff members, because the nature and expectations of a 15-year-old are really different today than they were 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. And McDonald's is always reviewing those things in this space to make sure they don't end up over there. So we've got to be a little careful about things we put down here, because when they go wrong, they can go catastrophically wrong. Now, sometimes that's due to the bad management within an organization, or laziness, or internal politics, or all those sort of things. And sometimes that's coronavirus. You know, sometimes the world just pushes us into this space unexpectedly. And that's exactly what's happened to us in the last 6-7 months. So what does that mean? Well, lots and lots of things, I think. So one of them is that in this space here, our first priority is to make people safe and make the situation stable. And if you think back, I think, you know, Jacinda's done a fantastic job of this in New Zealand. We've done an okay job of it in Australia, and we won't mention Donald Trump. So, you know, the focus here is to make people safe and make the situation stable, and then maybe come back later and figure out what it might be. And in that sense, what really matters is being quite directive about what people want to do. And, you know, and you have a fantastic example of this in New Zealand, sometimes overshooting what might be an easy solution. So, you know, one of the things that's got you to the great space that you are now in the coronavirus world is you went into hard lockdown really early. And lots of people went, oh, why are we doing this? This is a bit of overkill. But it's actually the response that was needed until we could figure out what was really going on. And that's worked really well for you. Another bit of this is that once we end up in here, we have to find new ways of working. And so, you know, when I met with Felicity and Steph in December, and even very earlier in the year, the beginning of February, about this course, it was all face-to-face and so on. And now we've had to find an innovative new way of doing that. So what we've got to try and do here is make sure that we don't lose the innovation that happens in this space. So one of the things that organisations that are good at this sort of stuff do is they have a team that's all about what do we need to do to make the situation stable, make people safe. And they have another team, and team can be one person, right? Another team that's focused on capturing all of the innovation that's happening so that we don't lose it and don't forget it. Because at some point, we're going to come out of here. So what we want to be able to do is manage the safety and stability of things here, capture the innovation as it happens. And the other thing, which again, I think is happening in a very positive and constructive way in New Zealand, is we need people who are starting to think about what does the next thing look like. So as we emerge out of the chaos, what do we want to, what's the new stuff we want to create? What's the new work that we need to do that leverages the innovation out of here, but acknowledges that we need to think differently? So I'm just going to pause. Oh, sorry, one more thing and then I'm going to pause. So again, in a military context, because they do some of this stuff really well, in crisis events in a military setting, there's a lot of work goes into making people safe, making the situation stable, managing that environment. But there's always a team that's focused on, and what are we going to do next? So what's the complex work that we're going to have to do as we come out of this space? So in chaos, make people safe, make the situation stable. Make sure you capture the innovation and get some people, even if it's a team of one or two, two is better, would be to think about what is the stuff we want to do. And I think the language you're using in New Zealand is about bouncing forwards, not just bouncing back. And that's a very productive way to think about it. How can we use the fact that we've been unsettled to think about creating a better way in the future, not just bouncing back to what we had in the past? So I'm going to press pause there, and then I am coming back, Rish, to your question. So I haven't forgotten that bit. Any questions or thoughts or observations on that bit? Okay, so the next comment to make is actually related to Rish's question. So if you ever have a chance to meet or listen to Dave Snowden, and I'll post a podcast link in a moment, Dave is almost without a doubt the smartest person I've ever met. He's incredibly high IQ, but incredibly broadly read, and has an amazing ability to bring all these things together. And so Dave would say that this Cynefin framework is ontological, epistemological, and phenomenological. You got it? Good. So what does all that fancy speak mean? It means that this tells us a little bit about the nature of things, ontology. It tells us a little bit about what we can know about situations, epistemology. And importantly, it's phenomenological in the sense that what matters is not just the situation, but how we experience that. So circling back to Rish's question, I have a mate, Steve. I've actually several mates called Steve. I'm that generation. So I have a mate called Steve, and Steve is a fireman. And Steve really is a fireman. And we had I think, quite terrible incident about 2 years ago now. We went away with a number of other families camping, and we had dinner. I had a couple of glasses of wine. I went to bed, but the others stayed up sitting around the campfire, drinking rum and things like that. And at one point, one of the dads, who had way too much rum, fell into the fire. Now, for most people, that's like, Steve just went straight into fireman mode. And he had Dave out, the flames off him, had ascertained that he needed to go to the hospital and figured out how we would get, it ended up being my wife, who was also the only other sober one there, driving down to the hospital. But for Steve, that what for the rest of us was absolutely this. Steve sort of knew how to deal with those sort of things because Steve spends his entire life dealing with that sort of crisis thing. So the extension, Rish, on what you said, is that not only do some people have preferences, are some people better in some phases than others, but our life experience determines how we perceive these things. And so if we spend a lot of time dealing with this stuff, then we become able to deal with it quickly and we perceive it much more like this. So, you know, if I pick, I'm just going to randomly pick someone off the screen here. So Warwick, you and I were having a chat a moment ago. What's your day job, mate?
My day job's in supply chain, getting goods and product to customers.
Okay, that's good. So my guess is that for you, most days, a lot of that, a bit of this and occasionally some of that, and you'd probably delegate some of the things that are straightforward down there. If you put me, parachuted me into your job tomorrow, it would feel like this.
Correct.
Right? Because I don't have that supply chain experience. And at the same time, if we didn't just parachute me in, but we parachuted you into my job, having to run these sort of Zoom sessions, et cetera, for you, it's going to feel like this.
Absolutely.
And for me, it's up here. So our experience of things is a function of how we experience things is a function of our life experience and the situation. And that's why in this sort of setting, it's really important, and good leaders have done this, to bring the expert in beside you. And so we've seen, you've had it in New Zealand, we've had it in Australia. The senior politician stands up and then hands off to the chief medical officer, who provides the expert view. Because if you've been reading anything in the epidemiology of this, coronavirus for an epidemiologist is just another mathematical puzzle. And that's what they spend their day job doing. And so, you know, it's important to understand here that we have preferences that we can develop to be able to work in different ways, and reflecting on our experience is a really important part of that. So Rish, I'm just going to go back to you. Does that make some sense of your question of earlier?
Yeah, I think it does. I quite like that concept of the lens. You know, the perspective really determines where you are on there. And I think you also kind of answered it somewhat unintentionally, I think, around the delegation, maybe for the simplicity, you know, some of the more simple things sort of get delegated down. I think it's unlikely that the same person is working on chaotic, complex, complicated, and simple. There's a bit of delegation along that route, I think.
Yeah, unless you're running a startup, I think that's absolutely right, Rish.
Yeah.
And just again to make something explicit out of that. So if you are a leader and you're trying to do all of this yourself, you're not giving yourself the time to do the real work of C-suite leaders, which is dealing with that complex stuff. Because that's where the really significant strategic challenges are. And if I can link this back in a way to Daryl's, I think, somewhat cheeky comment about, you know, going around and round and round a little bit earlier. One of the things that good leaders know is to take advantage of when this sort of accidental chaos happens in order to maximize the innovation potential from it, so that you can take stuff up there, figure out what this looks like in terms of what the experiments might be that we need to run in order to make things better, into principles and back around. So you don't always go that way, but that's a more common way of working. There's no guarantee, however, that once you get up here, that you have to come out. In the same way, there's no guarantee that if you get stuck there, you have to come out. But being able to work in the right way in each of these spaces is really, really important. So let me just pause again for questions, and then I want to do just a couple of other pieces, another couple of minutes, and then put you back into another little breakout group. So I'm just going to pause for questions or thoughts there.
One thing that happened in our team when we went into lockdown and we had to mobilize a business to work from home is that there were all these things that happened, and you talk about sort of lessons learned and capture innovation. And I feel like you go back to work in the environment again and those get lost. How do you bring that up as a thing to say, hey, let's get together, the working group, for example, if that's what you want to call it, to one, have that conversation, and two, actually extract some of those and apply them and continue to apply them so that they become best practice?
Yep. So I am going to answer your question, Kelly. I'm not sort of letting this one go through to the keeper. But the little point I want to make is that what you're doing is exactly the right thing, which is, so we've had this, but I need to work in a different way up here to try to get us to leverage that innovation and to turn it into something useful. So yes, we survived. What are we going to do next? And so when we're in that space, when we're working in that complex space, we know that what we need to do is experiments, right? That was our McDonald's lesson from earlier. And so my first suggestion to you would be not to think that you can sort of lock yourself in a dark room for 2 days and come out with the answer, but rather think, what's a series of experiments I could run to test the most effective way of capturing all of that innovation? So I'm just making this up, you know, standing here chatting to you, but I'd be trying things like, next time you have a team meeting, just put aside 10 minutes and get everyone to share a story about the most innovative thing they saw that the company did during lockdown. And then you might try another parallel experiment where you capture the top 10 of those, or whatever's the right number, and you send an email to other people at your level in the organisation and say, hey team, I just ran a really interesting little process here and I learned a lot. I'm interested in your views. And you might try a number of different little things like that and note which ones get traction. And if you find that when you tried to get 10 minutes of your team talking about innovative things that happened during lockdown, you could have had a 3-hour conversation about that, then come back and revisit it, scale it up. Make it a 5 or 10 minute feature of every weekly team meeting or something along those lines. Because the nature of working in that sort of complex space is that you'll need to do experiments. And eventually you'll come up with some principles. It's actually a good idea to set aside 10 minutes in every team meeting to capture new things that the team members have noticed. And that becomes then a principle here that guides the way you put agendas together for your team meeting. Does that make some sense, Kelly?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions or observations?
Just one thing that's kind of popped to mind, Patrick, you can't spend all your time on complexity, though, I think, because if you're constantly having ideas, then you can potentially get to a problem or stalemate where you can't implement the good stuff coming out of it. And so there's a level of overwhelm, not just for the group that's thinking about the complexity, but also the organization's appetite to consume the output or deal with the output. So any thoughts or advice around that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Really good observation. So I often talk about this in a setting like this because that's a lot of the work that senior execs need to do. However, exactly as you said, Daryl, just doing this can be intellectually interesting, but it won't help the business. You've actually got to do as McDonald's do and spin out of that the principles that you're going to use, and then look at which ones of those might be scalable. And so I believe that one of the things that effective senior execs do is they don't do the work, they set up the systems by which the work will be done.
Yeah.
And so your role in a senior part of the organisation is to set up the systems so that the insights out of here are captured as principles, and we know who it is that's in charge of trying to scale those things,
Yeah.
and report back.
And therein lies part of the challenge, moving from what you do every day now as a technical expert to, you know, getting out of the way of the other technical experts that you want, you know. So it's the old conundrum.
Yeah, exactly. How do you stop yourself getting in the way?
Yeah.
And as we'll come back and explore again in a little while later this afternoon, one of the traps for leaders in this space is to want to maintain control, because that takes a whole lot of energy and actually dampens the engagement of other people in the process. And success in this sort of space is actually about bringing in multiple perspectives and multiple stakeholders and other members of the team and that kind of stuff. And if you just try and control it, you'll strangle it.
Yeah.
And so you do have to sort of take a deep breath and release control.
Yeah.
Because this is a little bit philosophical for a Tuesday afternoon, but the reality is that you can't control it anyway. You can have a sort of comforting feeling that I am in control, but that's often misplaced or misleading.
Yeah.
And so owning up to that is really important.
A bit like a charcoal barbecue. Yeah. Doesn't matter how much you adjust the vents, you still want to charcoal your food, you know?
Yep. Now, if I can leverage off your barbecue experience there, Daryl, another thing that's really valuable in this space is not so much, a nicely roasted eggplant or something like that, but your ability to think analogically. So what you've just done is you provided us with a metaphor. This is like a charcoal barbecue, right? And in this sort of space, thinking by metaphor, by analogy, by example, is often a great way of engaging people in a process. Because what would have happened when you said charcoal barbecue, other than everyone looking up your address so they can come around on Friday night for the barbecue, is that sparked a whole lot of thoughts in people's heads. Right? Because for everyone hearing it, they interpret it in a slightly different way. And when you start a conversation about that, then you're increasing the number of perspectives that you bring into the problem.
Interesting.
And another example of that, again, in this space here. So it's not the part of McDonald's that I work with, but if you look at that global obesity epidemic that I talked about with McDonald's before, one of the things that McDonald's would have done, I don't know who it is, as I said, I don't know those people, but I'm sure that they said, where else has there been an industry that's been impacted at a sort of global level by health claims about its product? The tobacco industry. And not that you'd go and slavishly do everything the tobacco industry did, but you try and learn vicariously, sort of at their expense, from their experience. So what happened there, and what can we learn from that? Right, so the first thing you learn is don't do what the tobacco industry did, but right, you learn about what happened through someone else's experience. Because one of the things that matters in this space here is how quickly we can learn. And if we can have a really good, fast learning cycle in this space, that's what gives us the best chance in a quick moving world of succeeding, of being able to bring stuff around here. And so we do need a charcoal barbecue in the sense that what we need is an ability to think with metaphors, an ability to learn analogically. And related to that, one of the things that's really important in here is to learn from the stories that people tell. So Kelly a moment ago talked about capturing what happened during that innovative early phase of lockdown and trying to make that a better way of working in the future. How would you do that? You get people to tell the stories, because we all, these things are wired for stories. And so if we can capture stories here, that gives us a really good understanding of what it is that people are thinking and feeling, and they're really important data points.
Patrick, I was just curious if you had any advice on, I use a lot of cricketing analogies and it's completely wasted at Watercare. No one gets it. Any analogies that work on anybody, like a real good blanket analogy you like to go back to?
Oh, charcoal barbecue, mate, without a doubt.
Okay, perfect. All right, brilliant.
So let me answer a slightly broader question, Rish. And that is about stories and metaphors generally. We might be able to talk cricket later, but lots of people don't. The way to deal with that is actually to consciously build for yourself a really wide library of stories and analogies and metaphors. So I will now shamelessly steal Daryl's charcoal barbecue analogy, because I'm a bit of a bowerbird for stories and examples. And there will be places where I'll use a barbecue analogy and places where I won't. But if I've got a whole lot of stories up here, then I can draw on one that's relevant for this setting. For a little while, I did a bit of work with people running outsourced operations into places like Bangalore in India. And the cricket analogies go down a treat there, because, that's really important in Indian culture. But, I've done some work with, I'm doing some work in Brazil at the moment, for example. Cricket ain't going to cut it. But I've got a whole set of stories up here, and I'll just pull the ones out that are relevant for those people. Probably something about coffee.
I was just going to change the people around me. I thought it'd be easier if I just changed the people.
Yep. So there was another voice there.
I said barbecue will work for Brazil.
Yeah, it will. It will. What is it? Churrasco?
Yeah.
Brazilian barbecue?
Picanha.
Yeah. Other thoughts or comments? So, just to try and draw those threads together explicitly, so what's required then to do the work in this space? So what we've talked about is a fast learning cycle, and that to get that to happen, we actually need multiple perspectives, because as a leader, the chance of you having a sort of searing insight here is effectively zero. So multiple perspectives matter. What we learned from Jacqueline a few minutes ago was about the importance of boundaries. So you do want people to be running experiments here, but you need to be really clear about what are the boundaries within which those experiments can be run. It's important in here that we maintain a bit of a tolerance for ambiguity, because the fact that we're hearing multiple perspectives will mess with our heads. And we have to be a little bit comfortable that the work in the complex space is actually about seeking over time to work with those paradoxes. One group of stakeholders says this, another group of stakeholders says that. There's a tension there. How do I resolve that tension over time? And that only works, again, as we said a few moments ago, if we realise that we can't keep control over everything, that if we try to control things, we'll strangle them, and we actually need to open up the possibility of everyone in the team being part of the exercise of leadership in the organisation. So, Em, if we're right to go again, we're going to put you back into another little breakout. And again, you talk about, so what does this mean for the work that you do in your organisation? What is it that your organisation does well in these spaces? And where are the places where you think your organisation needs to work a little bit harder to be successful? So, Em, are we right to go with the breakout groups?
Yeah, all good. I'll put you in now.
Terrific. Okay, away you go. Again, about 10 minutes and we'll come back.
So I am operational improvement manager for the Lower North Island distribution centres.
Ah,
Yeah, yep. I'm actually extremely new to supply chain. I only jumped across business units about 6 or 7 months ago.
yeah, fantastic. Oh, well, you'd know a lot about trying to move things from complicated down to simple.
Yeah. Particularly before that, I've had a little bit of stints in research and development and a few other places like that. So there's a lot of that type of thing happening there.
Yeah, good. Okay, so it looks like we're all back. I'm interested in some feedback on what the conversations were that you were having. And I'm going to randomly, out of thin air, just get Swathi to talk a little bit about what happened in her group.
Yeah, we talked about our organizations and where each of our organization is at in that 4-quadrant space. So I think we've got examples of our organization sitting in maybe more in one quadrant than across all the quadrants, I guess, where, like for example, my organization has done some work exceptionally well, especially adapting to flexible work arrangements and remote working with COVID. But then there are other areas that it's clunky and not making enough traction. So I think, not fast enough, I guess, was the consensus. Is we're not doing it fast enough. We may be at different milestones of it, but not fast enough.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great, Swathi.
Hopefully my breakout roommates agree with what I said.
Yeah, well, it's all about, learning and making things better over time. So that's all good. I'm interested in another comment. Oliver?
Yep. Hello. In our group, we discussed how our organizations over COVID were quite good at cascading high-level messages throughout the organization. And I think obviously everyone having to work remotely kind of actually harnessed the chaos as such. And I think we kind of agree that most of the people in our organization who were essential workers kind of relished in the opportunity to kind of tackle bigger issues normally kind of outside of their day-to-day work. So I think, again, that came from the leaders kind of clearly outlining the priorities that needed to be tackled first, and then kind of working from there. And I think they did that through ensuring that through IT systems and programs that these were up and running, which allowed people kind of to get their jobs done day to day. So again, that was kind of from the chaotic segments and then moving pretty quickly from complex to complicated. And you could say they're kind of eventually getting into best practice in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's great. That's great, Oliver. So if I can just link Swathi and Oliver's comments together there, one of the things that can be useful to do is actually to sit down with your team and a copy of that chart and say, what issues have we got in which of these quadrants at the moment? Because that will help build a common understanding in the team about what's actually going on. And importantly, make it more obvious for you as a leader, what's the stuff down here that I should just be delegating? As opposed to what's the really meaningful stuff up here that I should be working on? And another part of that is that often when we're confronted with a challenge, it can just seem too big and too overwhelming. And if you can break it down into its constituent parts, so which bits sit where, you can actually understand that there are some things you can delegate, and therefore you can free up some brain space to actually do some of that more complex work. So, thinking about what sits where and what you can move through, your language, Oliver, was, how can we move things down here? To task that to people and get them to do that work for you. That's important. There's another link in what you've said there. So From a leadership perspective, generally the spaces below the line here are directive. So if you've done the work and you've got a standard way of operating, when someone comes to you and says, how do I do X, Y, Z, you say, well, we've got a standard operating procedure for that. It's process 47. Away you go and do it. Do you understand the process? Good. Away you go. Right? So that can be directed there. And over here, to Oliver's comment, what people look for in this space is really clear direction. And so, again, you've got a fantastic example in the way that New Zealand's dealt with the coronavirus thing nationally. Really clear instructions. This is what you have to do, because that's what people need here. So down here, very directive. Up here, you need to be much more consultative. So you need to engage lots of stakeholders, and as you move over here, customers as well, to think about how might we work with this stuff? How will we deal with this complex challenge? Because up here, particularly in the complex, but also in the complicated space, you need to be able to get those multiple perspectives, and you only get that with a consultative rather than a directive style. And so, you can see in the coronavirus situation that the language of leaders is starting to shift from, you've got to do this, the chief medical officer says this is the way, to we want to bring together groups of stakeholders to think about how we can best make something better given the turmoil that we've been through. A much more consultative approach rather than the directive approach that you see down there. So both are important, and knowing which one to use where is critical. So thank you, Swathi and Oliver, for those comments. One more. So who haven't we heard from yet? Azura.
So our group, we had a couple of different areas that we were in as well. So the first, most of us actually dealt with quite a few changes in the way that our business is currently approaching. Some were in complex, and I think I would probably say some were in the complicated. And it is evolving. Some of ours have been focused a lot on digital transformations, and that space has been fast evolving and helped with problem solving. And others of us had, depending on which teams we were working on, there were various different models which are a bit more traditional, like the 5 Whys, which we're using. So that's pretty much a summary of where we are at.
Yeah, so that's great, Azura. And one little thing to draw out of that is good leaders will know that you never waste a good crisis. And so your commentary there about needing to accelerate the digital transformation work that we're doing is a good example of that. And I'm working with leaders in lots of organisations at the moment who are taking the uncertainty that this has generated as an opportunity or a license in a way, to come up here and do that more complex work about how do we do digital transformation more quickly. Because this, I sort of hope, is a once in a lifetime opportunity. But we don't waste that crisis. We actually use it to think about how do we drive change that we know is necessary more quickly because we've been through this chaotic situation. So I've got, if I just think of a couple off the top of my head, I've got one CEO that I'm working with who's brought forward by about 2 years the organisational transformation that he knew would be needed at some point in the future, and he's using the opportunity of all of this disruption to get his senior leadership team involved in driving that transformation now while all this uncertainty is around. I'm doing some work with a financial services organisation, and they're doing the sort of stuff exactly as you were saying, Azura, that they've realised that because of the way they've had to operate during the coronavirus lockdown and so on, that they need to really engage their teams in accelerating their digital transformation. I'm working with a school, and the school is taking advantage of the changes that have come about through having to teach remotely and so on, to radically change the way they report on children's progress. So instead of just an ABCD thing, to actually be able to provide parents with more real-time feedback on how their children are progressing rather than waiting for a report. So, you know, there's a lot of wisdom in what you've said there. You can take advantage of this sort of crisis to drive transformation that might otherwise have taken a long time to get traction for. So good insight, thank you. One more? Is there a volunteer before I volunteer somebody?
Yeah, I'll kick in if you want.
Lovely.
We found a couple of our IT people here. The IT people seem to live in chaotic quite well, or survive with chaotic quite well, because you're quite regularly having outages and living in that space. So actually, we talked about COVID to an IT team. While it smashed us, wasn't really that much of a mental tax. It was just kind of, oh, here we go again, let's go. And we live in a complex. We did discuss that actually, when you get to the bigger IT firms or bigger IT teams, you often struggle to go from complicated to simple. You do have a habit of boiling the ocean and trying to get people to simplify things down and make them business as usual, best practice. We certainly in our business struggle with that change, and to get people to simplify those things down, because it's a certain amount of job, hold it to themselves, and there's a whole bunch of reasons behind it. But and I talked about, I've got a team in Australia, and the Australian culture is exactly the opposite. They are great at making things complicated and documenting them down and making them simple. Whereas my team in New Zealand really struggled with it. It was an interesting cultural change there, or difference between the two.
Yeah. And the other bit of that, Chris, is that there's always a cost in moving from here to here. And some of it is in, resourcing the team who can do the translation down into the simple. The other cost, which can be hidden, is that if you lock things down too tightly in a fast-moving world, you expose yourself to going off that cliff.
Yep.
And so not everything needs to come from here down to here. So maybe the Kiwis have got it right.
We'll find out soon enough, I suppose.
Yeah. So, don't think that everything has to come down here, but be thoughtful about what's the stuff that would best be down there. Good. Okay. So, one more little thing from me, and then I'm going to send you into a pair. I think, what are we going to do? No, I'm going to do this instead. We're running a little bit behind time, but that's okay. We'll make it all fit. So you've talked about your organisations. What I'd like you to do now is to start to think about the strategic project that you've got as part of this program, and to have a conversation, and we're going to put you into, let me just get the right, oh, hang on, no, I've got my run sheet wrong again. Let me just retract all of that and start again. So the next conversation, we're going to put you into pairs, and we want you to talk about what the implications of all of this are for you as a leader. So we talked a moment ago about what's necessary to lead in this space. We've talked about what's necessary for leading in, below the line here in that more directive space. So we just want to put you into a pair to talk about what does this mean for you and your leadership, because that's part of this whole program. I'm only going to touch on leadership lightly here. You'll do a whole lot more work on that over the modules to come. But the next thing, Em, if we're ready to go with those cross-functional pairs, are we good with that?
Yeah, already.
Terrific. So you'll go into a breakout room, you and a friend, and I want you to talk about what are the leadership implications of this for you. Okay, thanks, Em.
All right.
I'm always interested by what's on other people's bookcases. You can understand if you have a look there. What sort of stuff's on yours?
My bookcase, there's a whole lot of Afrikaans children's books. Because when we immigrated, we didn't want our son to lose the language, so we brought lots of children's books with us. So not just that, but I'd say about a third of this bookcase is full of that.
Fantastic. So what's the home language?
Afrikaans. South Africa.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So fantastic.
Other than that, all kinds of travel books and nonsense. I should really actually put up a background. I sometimes think mine is so chaotic. Everybody has these beautiful white walls behind them, and then my background looks like this.
Nobody's got a bookcase looks great. The bookcase looks great.
I know. I'm sitting here jealously thinking, man, this guy's got a lot of books. I wish I had a bookshelf like that. I've just got a spare bed.
You can get a background, actually.
I had a funny moment in a webinar Zoom thing I was doing the other day, a couple of weeks back, where I made reference to a book as part of the session, and I reached around and pulled it off my bookcase, and someone went, "Oh, you mean that's a real bookcase, not just a backdrop?" Yes, that's a real bookcase. Oh dear. Okay, so I think we are all back. So any quick observations about that conversation that you've just had? So Mike, I know I'll volunteer when I see one, and you're it. What was your conversation? Good.
So I was with Belinda. We had I think we probably could have talked for another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
About creating an environment where people can speak freely, be encouraged to fail fast, but set parameters so that failing doesn't cost us an arm and a leg and time or resource, or takes us down a rabbit hole while we're working on it. And as leaders, how do we create those environments and set parameters and pull people from different parts of the orchestra together, to use the analogy that Belinda used?
That's good. That's good. You've got to love a good analogy. That's great. Lovely. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go one screen across here and get a comment from Lucy.
I was with Andrew, and he was talking about being in IT and operating in the chaotic space and trying to make things simple. I'm in the military, so a lot of this is I'm quite comfortable with, because we get taught from the get-go about complex problem solving under time pressure and incomplete information. And then just talked a bit about, I guess, how we operate, which is I know what we work on intent or mission command. So the boss tells me what he wants me to do, but not how he wants it to be done. And so if anything happens, I can still carry on. And probably the other thing we talked about was allocation of time. We work on a 1/3, 2/3 rule. So if the boss gives me a task, I take 1/3 of the available time, and then my second takes 2/3 of it.
Hang on, Lucy, we just lost you in some feedback.
Sorry, IT. Is that
There we
better?
go. So the 1/3, 2/3, just tell us that. That's where we lost it.
So if I get given a task, I get 1/3 of the time to do my planning and issue my direction, and then my subordinates, if they get 2/3 of that time to then go and do their appreciation, their planning before we go and execute the task.
Yep. There's a lot of wisdom in that sort of stuff. I do some of these sessions with now a good mate of mine, Ben Pronk, who's former SAS commander, and he brings a lot of that sort of wisdom, just as you've said there, to the conversation. So really great to have that in the room. Thank you. Okay, so our last little task is where I mistakenly started to take us a moment ago, and that is, so what is all this going to mean for the project that you're thinking about doing, your strategic project for the course? And I think, Steph, people had a little bit of a warm up to that this morning, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we've had an opportunity to talk in smaller groups within our functions around what those initial topic ideas are and get some feedback around that. So.
Yep, good. And so Emily's just busy in the background there assigning people to tasks. But what we want you to be thinking about here is you'll choose a strategic project, something that's important for your organisation. To work effectively with that, you'll need to think about which bits of that task sit where. And I don't expect you to have the full answer to that at this point, but this is really just to start that thinking process. So Emily's going to put you into those pairs. We'll have about 5 minutes just to start your thinking on how this understanding of the Cynefin model will help you with the strategic project that you've got. Okay, Em, away we go. Here we are. I do like the face-to-face environment more than I like Zoom, but one of the things I love about Zoom is you push a button and everyone comes back, which would never happen in real life. So
you can push a button and make people go quiet.
Indeed, that's not too bad either. Okay, so as I said, we didn't expect you to nail the project in that couple of minutes you had, but I do think it's important to think about that as a framework as you start to do your own thinking about your project. So we're going to have what for you will be an afternoon tea break, and for me is a lunch break. And Steph's just going to talk to us about the timing and so forth on that.
Great, thanks Patrick. Excellent, so we've got a half an hour break, so we will see you back here at 3:30. Before you all run off though, what it might be quite a nice idea to do, it's getting a bit later in the day, but just have a think before or during your afternoon tea, a couple of key things that you have taken away from this afternoon already. So maybe some penny drop moments, some couple of key learnings, whatever it might be. Just so that you've got those down for you. Also, please don't log off. Just mute yourself. You can push your camera off for the moment. Go and grab a cup of tea or whatever you need to, and we'll see you back here at 3:30.
And remember, I did not encourage you to go and get a Big Mac and fries during break time.
Absolutely not.
Might be useful. The place I wanted to go first was into thinking about decision making and what does this mean for decision making. And then if there's any other stuff that you'd like to cover, please let me know. Very happy to work into the remaining time we have, whatever it is that's best for you. So if you remember, we've got our Cynefin framework here, and we want to think about how we might use this as a way of understanding what approach to decision making might be best in what sort of space. So, we mentioned earlier that McDonald's has got that simple space, teaching kids to flip hamburgers and run crews and that kind of thing. And they've got stuff up here in the complex space, which is around what do we do now that Uber Eats is here, or how do we deal with a worldwide backlash against our product and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that should tell us is that we need different approaches to decision making in different spaces. You had in your pre-read that article, Deciding How to Decide, which again used McDonald's as an example, which is sort of accidental, but they used McDonald's as an example and looked at different decision tools for different environments. And so that's where I'd like us to start. I know that in our group here, we've got people who are finance experts. And so that's an important aspect of decision making. So I'll be interested in your view on some of this stuff as we go through. So let's see how we go. Righto. So in this simple space and up into the complicated space here, there's some tried and tested tools that work really well in a business environment for making decisions. And if you're a finance person, you've probably gone straight away to something like a net present value or discounted cash flow approach, which lets us in a stable environment make a decision about which of these two investments is the best one for our business. And you can do that by looking at the value of money over time and using that to bring that back to today's dollars and comparing the two investments and making that decision. And that all makes sense. I had an interesting experience a bit more than 12 months ago now. I'm working with a big law firm, and the legal profession is being disrupted in the same way that financial services is being disrupted, in the same way that retail is being disrupted. And so there are lots of legal tech startups who are starting to nibble at the toes of big law firms and challenging their traditional model. The law firm that I'm working with, which is a global one, I'm working with their Australian practice, is a really good forward-thinking firm. And so what they've done is they've started up an innovation team, and the innovation team has identified the trends that will shape the future, and they've identified the startups who are doing interesting stuff. So I facilitated a workshop with them, the senior partners, their innovation team, really good conversation, a good awareness of the problems. And at the end of that, everyone's gone and I'm sort of pushing the chairs back under the table and tidying up the papers and that kind of thing. And the chief financial officer is there helping me. And the chief financial officer I have known for many years because I've done lots of work with the firm, and I would hold him in very high regard. He's a really sharp operator. Anyway, we're tidying up the papers and he says, you know, this disruption thing, it's going to be a really big deal. And what I would really love is, I just love it if the innovation team would go away and do a 5-year net present value calculation on which of those firms we should invest in, so I know which one to put our money onto. And I looked at him and I didn't say it, but I thought, how could you think that? Because the situation is so uncertain. We have no idea which of these firms will be successful, which of these technologies will work. We can't use the tools that work really well down here to make decisions in this space up here. And so choosing the right tool for the job is really important. So in this space, those traditional tools make good sense: net present value, discounted cash flow, those sort of things. I'm going to go there next and then come back across. So in a complex space, when it comes to decision making, we actually need to admit that often the best way of making a decision about an uncertain future is not to predict it, but to experiment our way into it. And we talked about that before with McDonald's. But I just want to very explicitly call out an approach that sort of sits across these two things here, which is design thinking. And design thinking is a very well documented approach that says that we can't predict the future. We've got to experiment our way into it. And very importantly, that we'll be most successful at that if we co-create solutions with our customers. And so the design thinking process is all about developing empathy for real customer needs, and then ideating lots of different possible solutions and testing those through experiments to end up over time with the best possible solution. And some of that you can easily see would work in a product sense. It's actually really good in a service sense as well. And one of the things I've done in the last couple of years is actually work with a finance department to help them re-engineer the way that financial reporting is done in their organization, because it's often the way that the finance people design the process and it doesn't actually work for the people on the other side. And that means that you end up in all sorts of argy-bargy about how's this going to work. And what we did was actually ran a series of workshops with the finance people and their internal customers and got them to co-create what a good reporting process would look like. And so dealt with the actual complexity of the problem by getting those people to co-create through a design thinking process a way forward for that. So design thinking is really important up in here. Another thing which we mentioned briefly on the way through is the charcoal barbecue. So analogy is really important there. learning through analogy, making our decisions by looking at how others have done in the space. And if you look at that deciding how to decide article, they refer to case-based analogy as one of the ways that you could do that. And that's really important. There's another tool that matters a lot, and again, sort of between these two spaces, and that is a thing called multi-criteria decision analysis, which to its friends is known as MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. And this is actually something that New Zealand does better than just about anywhere else. And it's the thinking, the approach, the concept behind the wellbeing budget that the government introduced a bit more than 12 months ago now. What that process acknowledges is that for lots of the important decisions that we make, particularly in a complex space, but also in a complicated space, we're actually trading off a number of different things. And the approach that we take should acknowledge that. So rather than thinking that we can reduce everything to a number, a net present values kind of number, we actually say, well, what matters is, and in New Zealand's context, that it was, yes, GDP is important. We also need to think about what does this mean for equality in the country? What does this mean for health outcomes? What does this mean for education outcomes? Consciously developed a process that would trade off those different things. The same applies in organisations, that in organisations, when we're acknowledging what really complex and complicated spaces are like, we're not just concerned with a short-term profit number. At the very least, we're interested in balancing out short-term profit and long-term profit. What should we make this quarter? What's going to matter over the next few years? But we're probably also interested in social obligations that we might have. So I don't know how much you're reading in this space, but one of the important threads in the way that businesses value themselves or are valued by analysts and others is what are called ESG principles. So environmental, social, and governance principles. And many of the big fund managers, for example, are making decisions about which firms they will invest in based on not just what's their profit this quarter, but what are their ESG, environmental, social, and governance credentials. And they're favouring companies who actually take responsibly their environmental impact on the communities in which they work, who actually are serious about the social impact of the work that they do and want to adhere to really high governance standards. And so in lots of places, this notion of environmental, social, and governance criteria is really important. And so multi-criteria decision analysis allows us to consciously make those trade-offs between those things. And I think this matters for organisations everywhere, because we're coming to see that businesses need to take account not just of this month's profit, but of the impact they have on the communities in which they operate. And an important part of that work is the notion of shared value, which is the idea that organisations should create value for themselves by creating value for the organisation, by creating value for the communities in which they work. And therefore, in any real analysis of a decision in these complex and complicated spaces, we need to be taking those different criteria into account. If this is of interest to you, and I hope that it might be, there's a recent book which I'll put on the chat in a moment by Rebecca Henderson, who's a professor at Harvard, and the book is called Reimagining Capitalism. And it really provides a great framework for doing this thinking about the responsibility of businesses to do good, not just to make a whole lot of money. And she frames it up really nicely that this is not an either or, this is a both and that whole notion for me requires us to do more of this sort of multi-criteria decision analysis work to acknowledge that all organisations are doing these trade-offs between different things. As we move from here over to here, we spoke before about the Six Sigma tools as being important for moving from complicated down to simple. And if you, I would imagine for many of you in the supply chain space, this would be an important part of what you do, to actually be looking at ways of continuously driving improvement, and the Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma methodology is really good for that. In this space here, in the complicated space, there are also a whole lot of tools from areas like decision analysis that actually allow you to take account of the inherent uncertainty that can exist in a complicated space and model that mathematically. I was having a little conversation with Timothy before, in the break before, and he's doing mathematical modeling of that sort of thing in a supply chain environment. And so that can be really important there. In the chaotic space, as we said earlier, one of the most important things, the most important things are to make people safe and make the situation stable, and maybe later come back and figure out why. And so this is a space where we need to act quickly, and we're wise to err on the side of being overly prescriptive early on, knowing we can ease back from there. So I'm interested in your views on any of that, particularly interested in our colleagues from finance or supply chain and IT to some extent, and HR as well, who deal with this sort of stuff on a day-to-day basis. Anyone want to start us off?
I was in a procurement role before this job, and one of the challenges that we had are exactly in those spaces. You know, price is always pretty easy to evaluate. Not always, but much easier. And understanding the metrics, for example, environmental metrics to make the decision, social metrics to make the decision. Those are some of the things that we as a company struggle to come up with.
Yep. Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts on that?
Sorry, you're just breaking up a little bit there. Kelly, just say
Oh,
that.
yeah, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah. I do. The first one is to agree with you that it's really hard. I don't want to make it seem like this is at all trivial. In that space, there's good work being done with metrics that sit underneath those ESG measures that I talked about before. And another good place to look is the United Nations United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. And they, the United Nations has done a great job, you know, pulling countries around the world together to agree on what's needed for true sustainable global development. And sitting underneath the lovely graphics they have on their front page are some clear ideas about what those measures might be. The last little recommendation is that it's worthwhile digging into Rebecca Henderson's book, if that's of interest to you, because she does a fantastic job of pulling the thinking on this together in a way that's really, really accessible. So as I said, I'll pop that up on the chat in a minute so that everyone can see it. Does that provide some help, Kelly?
Yeah, that is great, thanks.
Yep. There's another little bit of this that's worth noting, and that is that our business environments really are complex. So when I teach my MBA class, one of the cases we do is about IKEA. We do stuff about international expansion and the importance of purpose and all that kind of thing. But one of the questions that I raised with the class towards the end of the discussion is, so Ingvar Kamprad, who started IKEA, has he actually done a good thing or a bad thing? Because one of the things he's created is a society of throwaway furniture, because that's sort of what the IKEA model is. And I don't think that young Ingvar Kamprad, age 17, when he started out with this stuff, intended to start a global company that sold throwaway furniture. But that's actually what's happened as the business has grown. And so my first point is that we need to keep reviewing this stuff, because even if we set out with good intent, we need to keep revisiting it. And what many people don't know about IKEA is how committed it has become to sustainable production of things. So they were very early into sustainable forestry and sourcing all of their products from sustainable wood sources. And more recently, they started a global concept where you can take back a piece of IKEA furniture, and if it's in good shape, they'll sort of polish it up and sell it as second hand. And if it's not, they'll take it and break it down and reuse those pieces in products into the future. So that sort of circular economy notion. And the reason for saying all this, Kelly, in response to your question, is that if we acknowledge that we are working in a complex space, we will never get it exactly right. We will make mistakes because it's complex. The important thing is that when we recognize those mistakes, we remedy them. And that's IKEA's, move into sustainable forestry, their current concept about recycling furniture and so on. So I think from a procurement perspective, what you suggested there is really, really important. You won't get it 100% right the first time, but that shouldn't stop you from starting, experimenting, learning and improving.
I think that's the key, it's okay to fail or not get it 100%, 80% is fine in some instances.
Yeah. It is. I know in procurement often you want to be as right as you can be.
Yeah.
And we often fall into the trap of thinking if I've got a simple process, then that will give me the right answer.
Mm.
It might just give me a simple answer, which isn't the right answer for a complex problem.
Mm.
And I think there's there's all sorts of nuances to that, which I won't solve in front of the group with everyone today, but that's an important part of the procurement and the supply chain role. Any other thoughts or questions?
I think just a comment more to share on the things that we do here at F&P.
Yes.
You mentioned about Six Sigma. F&P have been following the Six Sigma or the continuous improvement process. It has been established in the manufacturing area where they continuously improve process time, to reduce waste. I guess the intention is to reduce waste. It has been moving also within the office space or in the engineering space and also in the supply chain. So in our supply chain team, we have a CI team even within the supply chain group that helps us with improving our process, either lead time or it's basically reducing waste. In addition to that, you talk about environmental and sustainability as well. So there is also that drive now within F&P to use materials that are sustainable and good for the environment. Some of the plastic that we use or the waste that we have, we recycle, use on tips, on gloves or something like that. So there is also a team specifically here that's working with the engineers. So I must say, so it's doing some of that. And the decision making that we do within the business also go within the, CI, there's that CI part of that decision making and environmental and sustainability that is embedded in our decision making.
That's great to hear, Jacqueline. That's great to hear because that's using the right tools for these spaces. And I think so long as you've got that review process that we were talking about before, consciously reviewing what you're doing in complex environments to make sure that you haven't locked in a simple process that actually is the wrong answer up here. And it sounds like that's where you are. That's great. That's great. Really encouraging to hear. Thank you. Other views? I'm interested in a finance person because sometimes finance people find what I've said to be somewhat horrific.
I think it sort of opens my eyes up as a finance person to ensuring that I actually go out and develop an understanding and of these other techniques other than reverting to type, you know, yeah. And then more specifically within my organisation is actually making them known. We're not a big organisation. We don't typically work to frameworks and have these techniques apparent in the business and actually making them apparent. And so we can actually move through the various quadrants because we tend to get stuck in each one invariably, or overcomplicate simple things and have things that should be at the bottom up the top. And so that's an eye-opener for me.
Yeah. No, that's good, Ryan, because, you know, just to tease out one little bit of what you've said there, you know, I've been talking about how inappropriate it would be to use these sort of tools for that sort of problem. What you've highlighted is the other bit of it, which is equally true, to try to use these sort of tools for something that you should have a standard process for. That's equally evil, you know, so having the right tool for the job is really important. Another little link to make, we spoke in the session earlier on about as you move to more senior levels, you become responsible not so much for doing the work, but for designing the systems by which the work is done. And so a logical joining of the dots for me then is that one of the tasks that might fall to you would be in your organization, how do you put a little bit more effort into the design of those systems to have good quality processes all the way through? And where possible, delegate to others to do the more straightforward bits of that. You know, I don't know much about your shop or your role or anything, but just listening to you, that sounds to me like that might be a really valuable piece of work to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit it on the head there. I get personally stuck with the simple things and not delegating out because I don't have the tools or don't believe the others have the tools to do some of the things. And maybe that's just probably the wrong approach to take into it at the beginning. But
and we'll come back to it in a little while, but part of the chorus of the song for the next half hour or so will be that we often think that we don't have time for good decision processes, and we should realize that good decision processes actually save time for the reasons you've just articulated. That if we all know how it is that we go about doing this and we've got good processes, we don't have to relitigate stuff all the time. We don't have to get stuck in, you know, the wrong tool for the wrong place at the wrong time. We've got a sense of how we do it properly. So that's really valuable. Thank you. One more.
David here. Just as a finance professional here, I think at times we try to have a simple response to something that actually the simple response isn't necessarily the right response. I remember seeing a business case that had savings in it recently, and the more of this product you bought, the higher the savings, and the savings were based on saving people's time. So you got to a ridiculous saving that bore no resemblance to what you would actually save in the organisation. And so I think the decision making. And when you look at discounted cash flows, there's so many assumptions that you make as to what's going to happen in the future that even though you come up with an answer, I'm always skeptical that actually it's right or even close at times.
Yeah, and just while I've got a finance professional on the hook there, David, one of my colleagues, Andrew Hingston, who is really good in this sort of space. He's an economics finance kind of guy. He will always make the point that one of the reasons why we end up with some of our environmental challenges, for example, is that those environmental challenges won't happen next week or next year and maybe in the next 5 years. And the way that discounted cash flows work is the further out you push something, the less it's worth in today's dollars. And so because these environmental things are actually still some distance away, their impact in a discounted cash flow sense on today is much smaller than the catastrophe that they might be in the future. And discounted cash flow makes us, because it relies on a simple methodology, make decisions driven by very good mathematics that actually are getting us into a bit of a pickle, I think. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why I like things like multi-criteria decision analysis, because it makes us more consciously trade off the profit we might make now and the world we might leave our children or grandchildren.
Yeah. I think the thing that I'd add to it, and something that I've struggled with, certainly in IT, and I suspect what has been alluded to there is by this technology, and you'll save all these people's time, it's almost impossible to quantify that unless you've got some benchmarking that you've done, and you've done some time and motion studies, and you're actually producing a margin on margin on margin oriented product. But if you're dealing with information, which ostensibly a large percentage of organisations are these days, it's really hard to quantify the value of that. And actually, most of us don't even put a value on our data or information, if you want to put it more appropriately. So the DCF, or the return on investment, they're based in 100-year-old accounting practices.
Yeah.
And so they have little value these days in complex environments.
Yeah. And Daryl, one of the things I think that the IT community, or at least some sections of it, have done incredibly well is adopt a more agile approach to decision making. That takes into account some of those, customer feedback things, but works with short cycle experimenting in order to make progress in lots of small steps towards an uncertain future. And so
constant value delivery.
Sorry, Chris?
Constant delivery of value rather than one big lump sum of value at the end and trying to show ROI on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave Snowden is a little bit of a pin-up boy for the Agile community. And if you ever saw Dave, you'd understand how funny that would be as a concept. But the Agile community really like this Kinevin model because it allows them to understand what the value of an Agile way of working is. So I think, there's a lot to be said, Chris, for that Agile approach and the constant delivery of value. Any more?
Just a comment from me. Sorry. I worked for Synlait, and a couple of years ago we took the step into sustainability big time, and we're now a B Corp and well on the journey. Now, the biggest learning for me is we just gave it a go, knowing that we wouldn't probably get it quite right, and we haven't got it 100% right. But we've learned that actually you can just recalibrate. So we've done a lot of things with our farmers, a lot of things across the business, put an electric boiler, for instance. If we purely did that on a financial business case point of view, we would have never done it. And the bet we made is that over time we would get the buy-in from our customers and it would pay itself back. Hasn't quite paid itself back at the moment, but the strategy is that it will over time. So it's not an exact science, and complexity there that you need to almost start and work your way through it and find out how to get to the right answer over time.
Yeah, that's great. And Rob, just while you've got the talking stick there, just for the sake of those who are not familiar with the concept, will you just explain a B Corp to people? Because I think this is an important part of the future for lots of organisations.
Yeah, B Corp is essentially it's kind of trying to balance, people, profit, and planet, and it's a really high benchmark for companies that want to do good for the world. So they take you through quite a rigorous process where you have to reach a particular level or benchmark to get through. And that took us about 2 years. It takes some companies about 5 years. But we're really proud of where we got to. And we're hoping that it will pay back dividends into the future. And it's just sewn into our strategy now. You know, though balancing all those, you know, I guess those three items.
Yeah, that's great, Rob. And if you're not familiar with the concept, you might like to read about it, or you might like to reach out to Rob over the course of the program and just connect on that, because I think it's a really, really big deal. As I said, it will be an important part of the future. And the world that we've lived in for the last 40 years or so, which says that the only thing that matters is total shareholder return, we're seeing now has had all sorts of negative consequences, environmental ones and social ones being two strong examples. And the B Corp model is attempting to address that, to make specific that you have obligations, yes, to run profitably, absolutely, but you also have obligations to the community in which you work. So, you know, do some reading or reach out to Rob, because I think this is a really big deal. So what we're going to do, Emily, is we're going to put people into a quick breakout, just for you to talk to each other about how does the decision-making thing happen in your organisation, and what are your takeouts from this conversation we've had about how you might go about improving that, picking up on the little conversation that I had a moment ago with Ryan, I think it was, about how important it is as a senior leader to be working on the systems by which decisions are made, no matter which part of the business you might be in at the moment. So Emily, when you're ready, we'll spirit people off to the breakout rooms.
Perfect, so I'll bob them in now.
Yep, good. Okay, any quick thoughts or reflections on that conversation before I go into the next thing? Anyone have any aha insight moments?
I was just, I also tried to take advantage of Dave's financial expertise to kind of ask. So I've been in the product development space for a while, and you know, we do a lot of design thinking, UX, prototyping, hypotheses, like all that kind of stuff. But it's relatively new at Watercare, and our finance team doesn't necessarily understand a lot of those concepts. And even if they understand it conceptually, I don't think they fully understand how to then go and build a funding model around that work.
Yep.
And, you know, we were talking about one of the other issues is Watercare primarily, the finance team deals with 60, 70, 80, $100 million infrastructure projects. And you come along and go, I need $1 million to do this experiment. And they're kind of like, yeah, so what, you know, like, and yeah, it can be a little bit tricky, I guess, to get that across.
Yeah. So Rich, one of the things that I'd suggest that you do is just connect with some of the finance people on this program here, because that will be your user experience cohort for that. And they'll be able to have great conversations with you about how you might go about rethinking some of this stuff. I think that'd be really valuable. That's good. Thanks, Rish. Any others? Okay. What I'm going to do now is just one quick little model about, it's a generic decision-making model. And I find it the most useful generic decision-making model. It's from a book by Chip and Dan Heath. And I can pop the name of that book on the chat as well for you if you like. And the book is called Decisive. And what Decisive is about is acknowledging that there are flaws in here. Sorry, that's the wrong language. There are ways that this thing works which get in the way of effective decision making. So they're there for really good reason from an evolutionary sense, but in a corporate environment, for example, they can get in the way of good decision making. And two of the really significant ones there are overconfidence, that we all tend to be overconfident about how much we can do. So if I was to ask you, how many of you think that you are above average drivers? If you're like most rooms, about 80% of people would put their hand up, which statistically is a little bit problematic. We are overconfident in our abilities in all sorts of things. And if you look at a sort of C-suite application of that, if you look at mergers and acquisitions, something like 70% of acquisitions fail to deliver on the targets that were put into the business case. And 45% of acquisitions actually destroy value. That is, the CEO would have been better off putting her feet up on the chair, making another cup of tea and just letting the moment pass. Because going into the acquisition process destroyed value for the company. Why? Because we're overconfident about how easy it will be to take this other organisation and integrate their systems and integrate their culture and bring their customers across, and it just never works that way. So overconfidence is one of them. The other one is, part of it is availability bias. So we rely on data that's easily available to us. But the real issue here is a thing called confirmation bias. That is, we tend not to look for the data that might be useful. We tend to look for the data that reinforces our current point of view. And so one of the ways to understand that is that, you know, you've got two major, two or three, depending on how you count them, major political parties in New Zealand. You will follow one or the other of those. If I give you a newspaper article, if you're from this camp, you'll notice all the things about what a great job that leader is doing and how rubbish the other side is. And if I give the same newspaper article to people of the other view, they will say what a great job their people are doing and how rubbish the opposition is. The same article, the same data, we interpret it in different ways. And also in organisations, we tend to fall into the trap of knowing what the answer is and then going to look for the data that will support it. So rather than having data-driven decision-making, we have decision-driven data gathering. And that's not a good place to be. So the Heath brothers have pulled together this really useful little framework that I'm just going to take you through now. And as I said, I'll pop the details up on the chat. But when I do this with my MBA students, I position it as, you know, we're going to do some sophisticated tools, but this is the one that you can use almost anywhere. And like all good frameworks, it's got a simple acronym. The RAP model, and the W is for widen your options. When I teach my managerial decision-making class, it's a 12-week class, 3 hours each week, lots of readings, all that kind of thing. And almost invariably, when I do a summary in the last class, so some bright young thing will put their hand up and say, so Patrick, if I'm only going to take one thing out of your class, what is it that I should take? And I think if you've been here for all that time and you're only going to take one thing, that's not a very good place to be. However, I answer politely and I say, the big thing is this: widen your options. There's all sorts of sophisticated axioms of decision science, which I won't bore you with today. And then there's Uncle Patrick's first rule of decision making, which is that the decision that you make can only be as good as the best option that you generate. So take time to generate good options. And that's what this is about, widening your options. So how do we go about doing that? The first thing is to try to avoid situations getting stuck where, do we do this or not? Because if it's a do we do this or not decision, we're really only thinking about one thing. Good decisions come from, do we do A, B, C, or D? A good range of options is something like 4, 3 is okay, but you don't want to be caught in that do we do this or not space, because in any meaningful decision that we make, it's actually the opportunity cost that we should be taking account of. By putting our resources into this, we're not putting our resources into that or that or that, and we should do that consciously, not just do we do this or not. You can actually make that opportunity cost apparent, and that can be really useful. If one of your team members comes to you and says, do we do this or not? A good response is, so if we suddenly discovered that what you're asking about here was illegal, immoral, and fattening, and therefore we couldn't do it, what might we do instead? Oh, well, I suppose we could, and then you're choosing between options. You're not just judging on do we do this or not. Another thing that's really important in this space is what I think of as the Richard Branson approach. So, you know, you work for lots of different organisations, but if I was to say to you that Richard Branson is going to take over your business, or you've gone into a joint venture with Richard Branson, you'll have no trouble imagining what that will look like. There will be really clever advertising, you know, a little bit edgy kind of advertising using the Virgin brand. There'll be a launch that will involve a private jet, a Caribbean island, young people in swimwear and that kind of Richard Branson stuff. And you can imagine what Richard Branson businesses are like. We're often told that we should think outside the box, and we're not good at that. What we are good at is thinking in different boxes. So a good way of widening your options is to run a little process with your team and say, okay, so let's imagine that Richard Branson took over our business. That's you, that's you three over there. This little table here, what would happen if we went into a joint venture with Google? And you over here, what would happen if we were offered a partnership with Gucci? What would we do? And it sort of doesn't matter what other companies you choose them thoughtfully, but you know, almost anything is good. And the whole idea is that if we're stuck in our own thinking about our own business, we're really limited in the options that we'll think about. But if we get people to think in those other boxes, they'll be much more creative. And so one of the ways of broadening the option space is actually to get people not to think outside the box, because that sort of doesn't work, but to think in different boxes. So there are a couple of ways of widening your options. The R is reality test, oops, whiteboard dyslexia, assumptions. So when things come unstuck, in my experience, it's almost always because there are unsurfaced, untried, untested assumptions that have been the basis for our decision making, and that's where we, you know, come to ruin. One of the most important things in reality testing our assumptions is actually diversity. Now, diversity is really important in organisations purely from an ethical standpoint. We should be encouraging more diversity within our organisations. From an inclusion perspective, that's really, really important. What most organisations haven't woken up to is that diversity is actually a business benefit as well as being an ethical necessity. And the business benefit is that when we've got a diverse team, we'll get different perspectives, and those different perspectives are important for decisions that we make. And importantly, it's not enough just to have a diverse team. We've actually got to have an environment that encourages dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T. The best research in that space comes from Charlene Nemeth. And Charlene Nemeth's research says that, there's lots of good things in it. I'm just going to tell you two. The first is that the value of dissent is not what we think it is. It's not that the dissenting party will convince everyone else that they're wrong. The real value of dissent is that the dissenting voice makes the people who are in the majority think about the assumptions that they've used to come to their decision. And the value of the dissenting voice is actually that it gives us more robust decision processes because it forces people to reconsider those assumptions. So the next little bit of it is that lots of research, Charlene Nemeth as well, says that if you've got one dissenting voice, then the organisational antibodies will crush it. So dissenting voices need allies, because if the dissenting voice has an ally, they're much more likely to speak up and say what they think needs to be said. What does that mean for leaders? Leaders often need to be that ally. So Felicity, she's top and left on my screen there. Felicity's in my team, and she says something that I actually think doesn't make much sense. I could say, Felicity, that's the stupidest thing I've heard all week. The chance of Felicity saying anything in the meeting again, 0. Now, even though I don't agree with what Felicity said, a good response is, Felicity, that's really interesting. Tell us more about why you think that. So I haven't said I agree. I've just said your point of view is valid and interesting, and we want to hear more of it. So one of the ways of encouraging the value of diversity in the teams that you work with is actually by becoming the ally for the dissenting voices that you've got. So that reality testing your assumptions is very much about allowing the power of different perspectives, the power of diversity, to be heard in team decision-making environments. The A is to attain distance before deciding. And that distance can be physical sometimes, often temporal in time, and very much emotional. Because one of the things that gets in the way of good decision-making is that we make bad trade-offs between the short-term impact of something and the longer-term impact of something, because we don't have a conscious way of trading it off. So one of my MBA students a couple of years ago had been a derivatives trader in his pre-MBA life. And that sort of derivatives trading is fraught with ethical dilemmas. And I talked about this in class, and he said, oh, Patrick, now I get it. That's why in the early days of our training, before we got onto the derivatives desk, they said, if you're facing a trade that you think might be a little bit ethically awkward, the thing to do is to say out loud, I made this trade because, your honor. And if you thought you could actually stand up in court and say that out loud, you're probably okay. And if when you said that your stomach tightened, let that trade go, find something else to do. And so creating a way of consciously making those trade-off decisions is really, really important. The way that these things are wired is that we often find it difficult to see that in ourselves, but we're really easily able to advise a friend. And so ideally ask a friend, but if you don't have one, stop and think, what would I advise my best friend to do in this sort of situation? Because that gives you a little bit of a perspective on the situation. And the last bit of this, there's a whole lot more in the Heath Brothers book, but the last one for this little session this afternoon is that if you're in an organizational setting, one of the things that you can use to give you that distance, to attain distance, to give you perspective, is actually to look at organizational values and organizational strategy. Because if they're well thought through, they should be the guideposts for the decisions that you make. And a corollary of that for your personal life is that if you are clear yourself about your own values, and if you are clear yourself about what it is that you want to achieve, you've got some clear goals for yourself, they're really important navigation points for your personal decision making, in the same way that organizational values and strategy are important in an organizational context. And so that's the attain distance before deciding. The P is prepare to be wrong. So to think through what would happen if you'd actually got this wrong. There's a whole lot of great writing, and I'll pop this on the chat when I send you to a breakout in a minute. A whole lot of great stuff on a concept known as a pre-mortem. So you all know what a post-mortem is, and apparently you can make entire TV series out of that sort of concept. The idea of a pre-mortem flips that on its head. And so the way that I would use this in an organisation, I'll keep picking on Felicity because she's in the danger corner up there on the top left. Felicity is the CEO, and we just had a strategy workshop. What I would do is I'd get Felicity to come and sit in a chair at the front of the room, and I'd say, now imagine this. Into your afternoon tea this afternoon, I've slipped something, and you all go home and you sleep, the executive team all go home and sleep for 3 years. And you wake up and you're dedicated employees, so you shower and then you come straight into the office. And on your way into the office, there's Felicity, sitting in the gutter, dishevelled, brown paper bag by her side and sobbing inconsolably. You really care for Felicity, so you come up to her and you say, Felicity, what's happened? And she says, oh, it's all failed. And you say, what's failed? She said, the strategy, it's all failed. But why did it fail? What would be the thing that Felicity would say next? So this leverages another little bit of the way this works. We're actually not very good at standing here and identifying all the things that could go wrong out there. But if I tell you that things have gone wrong in the future, we're very good at building a story between where we are now and that failure. And so the pre-mortem concept gets us to prepare for the fact that we could be wrong by thinking through in advance what some of those problems might be. Another good way to prepare to be wrong is to look for what are called tripwires. So what might be the early indicators that things are not going the way that we thought? And my very favourite example of this is actually an Auckland example. And if you think back to the time before the tunnel was operating, it was not too long before that, and it was about an hour from the business school in the centre of town out to the airport if you've got a good run, more on a Friday afternoon. I would always get a taxi. I had a taxi driver I used to use all the time to go from the business school out to the airport, organised on a text, yes, you know, pick me up 4:30, all good. And I get a text at about 4:15 saying, sorry, my car's broken down, but I've got this other driver for you. Okay, that's fine. So I go downstairs, there's the other driver. I get in the car. He says, where are you going? And I say, oh, you know, the airport. And he said, oh, you know, Sydney, yeah, Sydney. So we get down to the traffic lights at the bottom of the hill, and out of the glove box, he gets this really nice little leather clipboard with some outgoing passenger cards on it. And he leans back and he says, you might like to fill this out on the way to the airport. I think, oh, okay. So, you know, pull out the outgoing passenger card when those things used to exist. All good. And I'm a curious kind of guy. So I did that and I said to him, what's with the outgoing passenger card? And he said, well, here's the real reason. I've had too many experiences of getting someone out to the airport. And when I say that's $97, which is sort of what the fare used to be, people go, oh no, I've left my wallet and my passport in the hotel safe. And at that stage, I can do absolutely nothing for them. Too far to go back in and out again. So I've learned that if I give people an outgoing passenger card just when we're leaving, they'll discover at that point that they've left their wallet or passport behind, and then I can help them. I can take them back to the hotel, we can fix all that up. But if we wait till we get out to the airport, it's just an unmitigated disaster. And so those things are tripwires. What might be an early test, an early indicator that things are not going the way that we planned. And those things are always important, but they're really, really important in complex environments. So, any quick questions or thoughts on that? So I'm just going to pop you really quickly, Em, into breakout. We've got some pairs organised, is that right? No, Emily's been abducted by aliens.
Yeah, that's us. She's good.
All good?
Oh, yeah.
Terrific. Okay, so the last little breakout for the afternoon, just 5 minutes or so, or 6 or 7 minutes probably. What can you take out of our session this afternoon and actually think about applying in your organisation? Okay, all back, that's fantastic. So that's just about it from me. What I've tried to do this afternoon is to give you an insight into how complexity works, simple, complicated, complex and chaotic. Give you a sense of what's required to work in each of those spaces, giving you some decision-making tools that are relevant in each of those spaces again, and also to take you through that RAP model, which is a really good generic decision-making model. All of those things, of course, are useful for your organisation in an ongoing sense, and should also be useful for the projects that you'll be doing as part of this program. I've also tried, in the way that I've set this up, to position some things that you will pick up in more detail in the modules that will come. You'll do a lot more on leadership, you'll do a lot more on strategy, and all of those things are important, and you'll be able to see how they fit into that Cynefin framework. So that's it from me, and I'm going to hand over to Felicity, who's going to close out the afternoon for us.
Fantastic. Now that I've got myself out of the gutter, thanks, Patrick. I would really like to thank you for the kind of wonderful afternoon we've had, and it has been an enormous amount of sort of input from that you've given us, but you've distilled some of the complexity into some really simple things, and I think the RAP model is absolutely marvellous. And I do hope that other people reflect on that, and also to recognise the sort of some of the real similarities, the things that Mark talked about this morning in his practice as a chief executive and senior executive. You've actually raised as a in a model, or in a sort of some of the sort of the ideas that you brought forward this afternoon. So I think that's been really lovely. We hope that would happen, and it certainly has. So it's actually been a really good, sort of bookends to the day. So thank you very much, Patrick. Really appreciate it. In terms of everyone else, I'm sure that it's been a very different kind of day. I think most of us are sort of probably used to, people here are used to, going out and doing stuff and, sort of being active and what have you, not necessarily being on a Zoom call for hours and hours on end and sort of taking in this kind of, intellectual input. But I hope you've had a lot of opportunity to kind of meet a few new people and to think through some things and be challenged by some of the ideas that you're actually hearing. Actually, just on the chat, could you please just do 1 or 2 words about your response to today? So as I'm sort of talking, just 1 or 2, sort of top of mind responses to the day. And if that's, I'm exhausted, that's fine too, because I know, I know what that feels like. But just from response, just put it on to chat. Now, there's a few things that we're all going to be doing in the next, either tomorrow or the next few weeks, as before we come to the second module. I just want to go through what we will do for you, and then what you are going to do, not necessarily for us, but for yourself and for your organisation. So the first one is that we will put these references and the slide packs from today onto Moodle so that you will have access to them. That includes the references from the books that Patrick was talking about this afternoon, and any other references as well. Mark's slides also include some of the models and also a range of other things. He's put in appendices for you, so you'll have much reading material, which is really cool. We've also recorded the session, so what we'll do is we'll edit out all of the sort of palaver, like Steph, no offense, Steph and I talking about various different things. We'll edit those out, so basically you have Mark's session and Patrick's session, which I think will be incredibly useful, in fact, for all of us. And you'll be able to go over those things, and because as Patrick will attest to, will actually sort of, there's a small amount of remembering, and then it slides off the cliff very quickly. So we'll give you that probably in the next day or two. We'll also allocate your mentors if we haven't already done so, and you'll find that out by the end of the week, if not before. And also we'll remind you, we'll send you a sort of an announcement out about what is it exactly that you need to do prior to module 2. So we'll actually send you out that, but I will tell you just so that you can be prepared for it and you can get it all done this afternoon so you won't have to do it before. Okay, so what we would like you to do is, the first thing I think actually is to reflect on the day, and to do that before, you know, if you're going to drink, you know, sort of, and in the next hour or so, just reflect on what the key things were from today that you'd really like to remember. Because again, you're going to forget them. And I'd also like you to do that actually after you've had a sleep, because again, your brain processes stuff as you're sleeping. And actually there may be things that pop up for you tomorrow morning that just note down in a notebook somewhere. You'll get a notebook from us actually in module 2, but just write those things down so that you can reflect on them later. You need to develop your draft of your planning document. So that's actually what we'll either call a scope document. It's on Moodle. Steph has put together the stuff around the strategic initiative project, which we need you to look at the draft planning document. So that's the scope, the reason for your problem statement, scope initiative, benefits and risks, and the vision for success. So that's following up from today. Also to develop your draft project plan. Now that's really simple. We do not want any Gantt charts, please, unless they're really simple and cool. Just a project plan that takes into account that in each module, you'll actually be sort of feeding back to us what actually, and your colleagues, what progress has been made since the last module. So it's a sort of a gradual building on. This is not the kind of program that you would do if you wanted to leave everything to the last night and somehow or other come up to the advisory group. I think you've met some advisory group members. Don't do that. It's actually the whole process of learning. We don't give you assignments, but you do have the project, and that's a lot about how do you apply, what you go through, and also the sort of, you know, the insights that you come up with, even with your colleagues. Okay, now from those perspectives, as you've done that, talk to your manager if you haven't done that already, but actually just, you know, sort of reiterate that once we've allocated your mentors, organise with them how you're going to work together, and preferably to actually put in place some meetings in the diary, because that makes life a lot easier for everybody. And I think, was there another one, Steph? There was, no, I think that's actually it. I think that's really sort of getting your, I mean, you know, you've all done this, you're all doing major projects and what have you, but get those sorts of things sorted out quickly so that you can move on and, you know, sort of really get things underway. We do want you to do some research, and I know that's in the strategic document. If you need some help with that, or what does that actually mean for you, please get in touch with Steph or myself, and we'll provide you with that sort of, you know, context stuff. And I think just let's have a look. What are we seeing in the chat group? Lots of tools. Yeah, tools. You've got lots and lots and lots of tools. In fact, actually, if we stop now, you'd probably have enough tools to be going on with for the rest of your leadership life. That's really awesome. Enjoyable day. Yeah, good. Certainly Zooms, as we've all found, are sort of probably quite tiring. The next ones, of course, will be face-to-face, so you can actually have a good chat. And of course, we will have drinks and dinners and all those things too. So I think that ends our day. Thank you very much for all being here. I don't think we've had anybody drop off the planet. And we absolutely look forward to seeing you in September, on the 1st or 2nd of September. And just get in touch with us. Just don't hesitate to get in touch with us. So I think that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks,
Patrick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you.
Thank
We're all off to McDonald's.
Yeah, good idea. does.